Welcome to this short presentation on the release of information process. We're going to cover a topic that I think leaves a lot of our patients and staff confused, and I'm hopeful the information I share with you now will eliminate or at least reduce some of that confusion. Just a quick introduction. My name is Laura Van Valkenburg, and I am the Health Information Management Regional Manager for Ascension Medical Group. Let's dive right in. The Authorization for Disclosure of Protected Health Information form is a HIPAA-compliant form that patients can use to authorize the disclosure of medical record copies. Patients may want their records released for a variety of reasons, such as for personal use, to be sent to another healthcare facility or provider, disclosed to their employer for FMLA or workers' comp purposes, just to give a few examples. If the form is not completed properly, it may lead to a denial and/or a delay in the release of information. So let's walk through the form. The appointment date in the top right is helpful if the patient is needing records to arrive before an upcoming appointment. It is not a required field, but it is helpful for release of information offices to know if there's a specific time the records are needed by so that they can prioritize their work. The Authorizes Disclosures By section over here on the left is where the patient indicates who is allowed to release the records. On the right-hand side is where the patient is going to indicate who is authorized to receive the records. So if the patient is wanting us to release their Ascension Medical Group records to an attorney, they would indicate Ascension Medical Group on the left-hand side and the attorney's name and full address on the right-hand side. It is important that the patient provide the full address. The patient should be able to give that to us or provide that for the form. However, you can offer to help look it up for them if they need assistance. Why do we need the full address? Well, the release of information offices cannot guess where the records are to be sent. So filling in the complete address is critical. The other thing, if this is a request that's going to another healthcare facility or a request for records between healthcare facilities, it's a good idea to always include a fax number for the department because most release of information offices will fax records as long as there are not too many pages, and that can speed up the process of the release. Also, if this happens to be for requests for us to get records from someplace else and you've indicated your department's Athena fax line, then the records come to us by Athena fax and Athena will process them, as opposed to if they come to us by the mail, then somebody in your department is going to need to barcode label them to get them into the Athena charts. Moving on to the next section of the form, we've got the information to be disclosed section. And this is really important. We want the patient to be as specific as possible to avoid releasing information that is not necessary or more information than is truly necessary. So often we see this form come in with every box checked or just lines drawn straight down through all the boxes. And that's probably far more information than is truly needed or wanted. For example, if the patient is wanting copies of their medical records sent to a provider in Chicago that they're seeing maybe for a second opinion, that provider in Chicago is not going to want the billing information. So again, we want the patient to be specific so that more information isn't being shared than is really necessary. I also want to point out that this authorization form is used for hospitals and clinics. It's a standard authorization form. But our legal health records right now between hospital and clinic are still separate. So if the patient needs emergency department records or operative reports, the request needs to go to the hospital where those services took place. In the middle of the form, you'd see the disclosures requiring special consent. Under federal and state law, certain disclosures do require a specialized consent. For example, a patient may want copies of their medical records released to an attorney, and they want to include mental health and AODA records. If that's the case, they would need to indicate that in that section. Next is for the following dates field. Again, we want the patient to be as specific as possible so that we do not over-disclose information, disclose more than is really necessary. And I want to point out that the to date really cannot be a future date. The release of information offices cannot release copies of records that do not yet exist at the time the patient signs the authorization. The next section is for the patient to indicate the reason for the disclosure. And this is important information for the release of information offices, as it will help them decide the workflow or process needed to complete the release. Different types of release requests have different turnaround time requirements, and there are certain types of releases that they're permitted to charge for copies. Also, you'll see in this section there is a spot to indicate for verbal use only. This form could be used to document the patient's consent to verbally communicate with certain people. That does not mean that the person that they've indicated there can get medical record copies. In order to get copies of the medical record, the patient would have to fill out a specific authorization allowing the information, the specific information they want, to be released to that person. This would be to indicate for verbal communication only. Now moving down to the bottom section of the form, the expiration date is 1 year. However, the patient may indicate a shorter period of validity. We recommend the patient not put a date greater than 1 year for expiration, as things can change and they may forget that they have signed this form. It's really for their own protection that the authorization be valid for no more than 1 year. The form must be signed and dated, and you want to be sure that the patient signs in the correct spot. Often we find the patient has signed in the patient hand carried section, and that is to be used if the patient is picking up records from the clinic. So, for example, the audiology department oftentimes will give a copy of the audiogram to the patient at the appointment. They would have the patient sign in the patient hand carried section. They would have the patient sign on the patient signature line authorizing the disclosure, and then they would have the patient sign on the patient hand carried line to indicate that the patient took that record with them. Oftentimes it comes in with the signature line only being on the patient hand carried line, and that really makes it look like the patient has what they need and no further action is needed. So you want to be sure that if it's an authorization for disclosure, you have them sign, always have them sign on the signature and date line, but then if they are picking up the records in the department, have them sign the patient hand carried line. The very bottom of the form is meant to document any releases that you do in the clinic. So if you release a copy of lab results, for example, you would fill in the bottom section with the date that you received the request for the patient, from the patient, the date that you processed the disclosure, your name or initials, and whether you mailed it or if the patient picked it up. In this example, notice I did not give you the faxed option. We really don't want to fax protected health information to non-healthcare entities. So if the patient is asking you to fax something to their work, we don't want you to do that because that's not a secure means of communication. It would be best to mail it to their home address or have them pick it up. So that's where you would indicate if you've processed the release right there in the clinic. Now I'm going to talk about some of the common errors or problems. We see a lot of the same types of errors occurring over and over again, and here are the most common, most problematic ones. Patients mix up the disclose by and the disclose to section. Be sure that the full address is provided in the disclosure to section. Make sure that they did not just check affinity or ministry in the disclose to section. If only that is checked, the other healthcare facility will not know where to send the records to. As I mentioned before, we often see every box checked in the information to be disclosed section. This will likely result in more information being released than is truly necessary or wanted. Most providers that are seeing new patients only want the last 2 to 5 years of pertinent medical records. Having the patient write all or mark every box is going to be overkill. I'll share a situation we had a few months back here in Rhinelander. A box arrived in the mail and was brought down to the HIM department. It was a copy paper box, and you all know how big a copy paper box is. You can visualize that. It was full of one patient's incoming transferred record, which means there were about 5,000 pages of records in that box. I personally delivered that box to the provider, and he said, "What's this?" And I responded, well, these are the records you requested. And he said, well, I didn't want all that. So I showed him the authorization form that had been filled out by his assistant, and they had the patient sign it, and it clearly said all, that they wanted all records. And he said, I just needed the discharge summary. Now think about the wasted time and money involved in that release. It probably took hours for the release of information office at the other healthcare facility to copy or print those records, box them up, and then ship them to us. All he wanted was the discharge summary. We also see the for the following dates showing a future date. And remember, release of information can only release what exists at the time the patient signs the authorization. They can't disclose things that have not yet occurred. Patients often add a date that's more than a year out in the expiration field. And again, this is a risk to the patient and should be discouraged for their own protection. Sometimes patients forget to sign and date the form, or they sign it on the wrong line. Remember, if they sign on the patient hand-carried line, that means the patient has what they need. So the release of information office will likely ignore that request because they'll assume the release was completed already in the clinic. Then we occasionally have someone other than the patient sign. Only the patient or their legal rep may sign the authorization. A parent may sign for a minor child, but once that child turns 18, in the eyes of the law, he or she is an adult and must sign their own consents and authorizations. A guardian must sign for their ward, and we must have a signed guardianship order on file. A healthcare agent must sign for an incapacitated patient, and there must be an activated power of attorney for healthcare on file with a valid statement of incapacity. Now, there is a lot of misunderstanding about how the power of attorney for healthcare process works. So I'll take a moment here to just cover that. A person can designate who they wish to make decisions for them if they become incapacitated and are unable to do so for themselves. Until two physicians declare the patient incapacitated, the power of attorney for healthcare is really just in standby mode. For example, my brother has asked me to be his power of attorney for healthcare. That doesn't mean that today I can walk into the clinic where he goes and obtain medical record copies. He is handicapped, but he is still able to make his own decisions and has not been declared incapacitated. Therefore, I'm just kind of waiting in the wings. Lastly, for deceased patients, the surviving spouse, domestic partner, or personal representative may sign the authorization. Finally, in the last few months, we've noticed that occasionally the forms printing out of Athena are not printing properly. The signature line is printing too close to the top of the page, resulting in the patient either not being able to sign it where they should, or they sign it, but once the form is faxed, the signature gets cut off by the fax header that automatically prints on the top of the faxed page. So please be on the lookout for this. If you see this happening to the forms that you print out, call the IT help desk right away and ask for field services to update your PC settings. The release of information offices will deny requests if the signature line is not legible. Now let's talk about a couple of common misconceptions. A signed authorization is not required for continuing care purposes unless the patient has requested a restriction and the request has been accepted by the organization. A clinician's office may request records from another healthcare facility or provider without a patient authorization. HIPAA allows sharing between providers for the purpose of treatment, for continuity of care. And I would like to introduce you to a new form that I've created that you can use to request records for patients transferring their care to us to support a referral or to support care coordination. This fax cover sheet can be used to request records for patients that are transferring their care to one of our providers. It does not require a patient to sign an authorization. You can handwrite your address and fax number here in the middle, or use a stamp if you have a department stamp. Work is underway right now to have this form created in Athena so that when it's printed out, it would autofill with your department information. But until then, you can use this copy. I have sent this form to all the managers and supervisors, so if you don't have a copy of it, you can touch base with your manager or supervisor. When new patients transition their care to us, please use this form instead of asking them to complete and sign the more complex authorization for disclosure form. That way, you and the provider can be more specific with what information to request. So down here, you can indicate how long, how much time. Maybe the provider you work with always wants the last 2 years of records. So you would indicate that here. And then down below, you can indicate additional information if it's needed and the date range of that additional information. Be sure to include your department's Athena fax number so that when that other healthcare facility is going to send the records, they can do so by fax, which then means they'll get to you faster. They'll get processed through Athena much faster than if they are sent by mail. Now here's my disclaimer. HIPAA does not require a signed authorization form for continuity of care purposes, but there may be other healthcare organizations that have an internal policy that requires it. So just, maybe one time out of 100, you may get a response back from another healthcare facility saying, please have the patient sign an authorization form. But the majority of the time, this provider-to-provider fax cover sheet should work just fine. The second misconception is about mental health records. Wisconsin used to have very strict privacy laws around mental health. However, in 2014, the HIPAA Harmonization for Mental Health Care Coordination Bill was passed, and it removed barriers in Wisconsin law to the coordination of care for persons with mental health diagnoses. It basically aligned Wisconsin law with the federal HIPAA law for disclosures made for treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. So for mental health records, this means that mental health information, except for HIPAA psychotherapy notes, may be disclosed without the patient's consent to the patient's other treating providers. HIPAA does not treat mental health information differently, except for psychotherapy notes. Many mental health providers do still get a signed authorization from their patients, though, because they feel it helps maintain trust between them and the patient, but it's no longer required by law for mental health records. One very important thing to note, though, HIPAA harmonization does not apply to AODA treatment records. So let's talk about AODA. Alcohol and other drug abuse records are restricted under federal HIPAA law, and the patient must authorize disclosure. Because of this, we cannot add incoming AODA records that we receive from other healthcare facilities into Athena, as there's no mechanism to lock them down or restrict them to only the patient authorized to receive them. Therefore, the receiving provider should either document relevant information that they obtain from the AODA records in a chart note or retain the paper copy in a secure storage area in their office. Moving on, let me talk briefly about patient rights. Patients have the right to revoke an authorization they previously signed. The patient must do so in writing. We do have a special form that they can use to do this. However, they can provide a handwritten note with the request as well. If you receive such a request, please process the document by barcode labeling it as admin HIPAA/privacy document class, and the label would be revocation of authorization, and send it to review. Do not select close, as that will just file the document in the chart and it won't go to the HIM team for us to do what we need to do with it. The patient should be made aware that if we have already released records, we are unable to go and retrieve what was already released with their prior authorization. So for example, if a parent signed an authorization to share medical records with the child's teacher 2 weeks ago, and now today they want to revoke that authorization, if we mailed the records per the previous authorization to the teacher 2 days ago, we can't go and retrieve it. We can't go and get it back. Now, once HIM receives the revocation request in our task buckets, we will add an action note to the original authorization like this, and we'll pin it to the top so that it stands out. And we will also add an internal note over here that says revoked. This will help draw everybody's attention. So if somebody were to bring up this consent form, this authorization to disclose form, it clearly says that the authorization has been revoked per the patient's request. The document, then, the original document that the patient submitted to request the revocation is going to be found in the Admin HIPAA Privacy section, and you would see the word revoked in the internal note. I'm sorry, accepted in the internal note section. Now I'm going to walk you through how to use the chart export functionality in Athena if you're going to process a release right in the clinic. This is an ideal tool to use because it will document what was released, when, how, and to whom. Let's say the patient wants you to give them a copy of their last office visit note. Have them sign the authorization form, which will authorize the release to the patient. Then in the patient's chart, you would click on the 3 bars in the top right under the log out. This will open up the menu, and then you would select chart export. The chart export box will pop open. First, you want to check the date range to be sure it includes the dates that you need. The default is year to date, which is actually fiscal year, so starting July 1st. So for the information you need is from before July 1st, you're going to want to click the drop down arrow and pick a different option, either all time or previous year, in order to get an earlier date. Then on the left side, you will want to pick the attachments that you want to include in your release. So over here you have the available attachments, and you'll see the little plus signs. If you click a plus sign, it'll expand and show you more options in those different categories. The clinic office notes show up under encounters and procedures. If you click the plus sign, you'll see the individual appointments. In this particular case, I just had, this is a test patient, and there was only one appointment showing. If you hover over the line for the appointment, you'll see a View Documents pop up. You can click View Documents to actually take a look at the document to make sure the one you want. Once you have identified the items that you want, you can highlight them and then use the Move Over arrow button. And go through the list on the left, picking out what you want, and then use the Move Over arrow button. If you've moved something that you decide you don't want, you can click on it and then move the back arrow to move it off the selected attachments list. Once you have added all the documents that you need to include on the selected attachments side, click the Export Chart section. Next, you need to indicate the method of the release. Select either paper printout if you're going to be mailing it or giving it to the patient. Select Athena Fax if you're going to be faxing it to another healthcare facility. If the release is to another healthcare facility or provider, search for them. Validate the address and the fax and phone number is correct. If the release is to a patient, you can type the patient's name in the Send To field. It is actually a free required field too, so you will need to put something in that field. Always, always, always validate that you have the right location by comparing the address, phone number, and fax line. There are 2 optional fields for attention and note. In this example, I added an attention to Dr. Smith, and in the notes I put pre-op clearance. It kind of acts as a subject line. In the middle of the screen you see preview, If this were live, you could scroll down and you would actually see what the release will look like with the deaths you have selected. If everything looks good, then go ahead and click Save. For paper printouts, please add an action note that tells what you did with the paper copies. For example, paper copy given to patient. Now you can complete your submission by selecting By Paper Printout and Save. It's very easy. Now in closing, I'm going to recap here. I'll review what I would like you to do and what I don't want you to do. So do assist the patient by giving them guidance on how to complete the form. Please don't just hand it to them. Please review the form for completeness and accuracy before that patient walks away. That way, if you do find something's missing, they've maybe not signed on the right line, maybe they've left off what is to be disclosed, or they don't have the full address, it's so much better to catch them before they walk out so that you can get all the information. And that request doesn't get rejected, and then weeks go by before a new request can be completed. If the request is to obtain records from another healthcare facility, fax or mail the request to the other healthcare entity. Don't fax it to our internal release of information office, as they do not release records for other healthcare facilities. So, for example, if you need records from ThedaCare, it must be sent to ThedaCare. And please write faxed to ThedaCare and the date on the request once you've sent it off to that other healthcare facility, and then fax it to your Department Athena line. That way, when that release comes into Athena, all release of information requests kind of automatically route to the release of information bucket, and it has to be reviewed by somebody on my team. They can see immediately that you have taken care of faxing that request to that other healthcare entity. So in the example of needing records from ThedaCare, if you've indicated fax to Theta on November 19th, 2018, we will know you took care of it. If we don't see that on there, we're going to push it back to you, asking you to confirm whether or not you faxed it to ThedaCare. If the request is for release of our Ascension Medical Group records, fax the request to the Release of Information Office that services your clinic location. The authorization will be uploaded into Athena once our internal Release of Information Office has completed the release. And now for things I don't want you to do. Please don't just hand them the form and offer no assistance, or tell the patient to mark every box in the information to be disclosed section. Don't accept an authorization form for release of medical record copies that's for a future medical record, things that don't exist today. And please don't fax all of your requests to our Release of Information Office. Remember, if it is to request records from ThedaCare, from Marshfield Clinic, or from Aurora or Aspirus, you need to fax or mail that request to that other healthcare entity. And then please don't request info from another Ascension Medical Group provider unless that information that is needed is pre-Athena and your provider doesn't have access to the historical EHR. For example, we have two legacy EHRs in our clinics, Cattails on the ministry side and GE-EMR on the affinity side. So providers in the two regions can't necessarily see those legacy systems or those legacy records. In that case, it would be appropriate to request. Now I just want to cover some resources. There are resources available to you. You want to see the Athena Health implementation page for the Release of Information workflow, as well as this recording, if you need to review it again. Your managers and supervisors, you want to see them if you need a copy of the provider-to-provider fax cover sheet. And also I have sent them a sample of the authorization for disclosure form that you can have handy to assist you in helping patients fill the forms out. If they have not already distributed them to you, please ask them for copies. If you need a copy of the revocation of authorization form or the form to request restrictions, you can contact me. Also, if you have questions after you've reviewed this session, I'm here to help, so please don't hesitate to contact me directly. This is my contact information, my email, and my phone number. I want to thank you for your time and attention and appreciate you being here and listening to this. Have a great day.